What is going on, Peacemakers, and welcome back to another video. So today's video, we are finally launching the segment, What is Sin? So this segment contains a lot of information about what we know as the biblical term of sin. We're going to be analyzing individual sins, but before we get into all of that, I want to get into the history of sin and why is sin so bad. I think that's the most obvious question that we as Christians have to really understand in order to get our point across, to have others believe or understand why it's so bad. Okay, and I think I think that it's so important that we all as Christians have a good answer to understanding God's commandments in our lives. Have a good answer for why the Bible says what it does, and have a good answer for some of the misinterpretations or myths that people have developed over the years in terms of understanding who this God is, and why he's so important, and why we are in his in his universe, or what role do we play in his universe. I think one of the greatest conversations that we can really have to give us a better understanding of how we should perceive the world that he's created, I think we have to ask the question, what is sin? Why is it so bad? All right, so with that being said, we're going into phase one, which is history of sin. So the fall really is the beginning of all of it for us. Chapter 3, and then so I'm just going to go over Genesis chapter 3. We really have to go to the beginning to understand the implications of sin, and it's in its full just in its full definition of what it is, to get this idea as to why it's so bad later down the road. So the fall of humanity starts in Genesis chapter 3, where in verse 1, where the serpent is introduced, it says, now the serpent was more subtle than any other beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Ye hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree in the garden. So it starts off with telling us this interesting character in the garden, where God had created Adam and Eve, and the where this serpent resides in, at least, right, for the time being. Now, I like how this brief understanding of the serpent is given, that it was more subtle than any other beast in the field. And I don't know, there's some implications here that really we take for granted, and we read it and we're just like, first of all, how can the serpent talk, right? That's one of the I think one of the most interesting questions that aren't going to be covered in this video, but it gives us something to look forward to that we could dive into the future. So with that question aside, I'm not going to be answering it, but staying focused into it, we're going to be going into God's curse. So Adam and Eve, Eve and the serpent are talking for a little bit, and the serpent is basically questioning God's authority, right? Or questioning God's word, because he's twisting it, he's altering it, and he's saying that surely thou hast, basically what he's saying is, surely God said that you can eat from every tree in the garden, right? And Eve's response was yes, but not the garden, or not the fruit that is in the midst of it, for we should surely die. And the serpent says, Ye shall not surely die if you eat from the midst of the fruit in the midst of the garden, but ye shall gain knowledge of good and evil, and you should surely be like God. So right then and there, it's the temptation is already there. right? Sin is not necessarily the temptation. Sin is, or I'm sorry, um, the temptation is rather just a uh man it's not necessarily, it wouldn't be right to say, to classify it as a sin to be tempted, because we're tempted all the time. However, the struggle between the flesh and the spirit is at play during this time of temptation. And I think that it really goes to show character or self control, discipline in one another. When we exercise that and when we gain a better understanding of ourselves, our wants, our needs, our desires, in a way in which ultimately would lead to serving God in a much more you spirit filled way. And I'll get to why that's so important here in a moment. But then it says, then we go into God's curse for man. So basically, long story short, she falls into temptation. She gives in to the temptation. She bites into the forbidden fruit, and then she gives it to Adam, and they bite. Both of them bite into the forbidden fruit, and then it was revealed to them of some form of consciousness that they didn't have before. Forgive me. Then they realize, they have this epiphany. They have this realization that they were naked. And I think that right there is very interesting, because of all the things that we see before the fall, we can apply that. We can apply the change that was made before and after the fall. So we see what man had and what woman had before the fall, and we see what gets taken away from them after the fall. And I think the curse, implies a lot more than we may realize, right? So let's jump into, hold on, let's jump into the first, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Now, I want to go back to that first part there, and it says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman. So, upon this realization that these creatures from the dirt, that God refers to as humans, that he made in his likeness, in the image of himself, they disobeyed one of the only, as far as we can tell, one of the only rules that they had in this new universe that they were just created in. And I think it's it's kind of interesting when we dive in a little bit further into it, and we see that after the fall, he creates, and we just read it, he creates enmity, which means hostility, which means basically annoyance, or hostility is a good word for it, right? It creates he put hostility in between the woman and him. I think that's interesting. Because it gives us a better explanation to why arguments may just conjure up out of nowhere, right? It gives a little bit of explanation as to why we bicker and argue in times in which we just really shouldn't, in times in which don't really make sense, right? And I think one of the coolest explanations for this is what Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 just told us there, is that God put enmity, put hostility between man and woman. I think this is really cool. Now, it's not confusion. It's just hostility. It's just annoyance towards one another. It's bickering. It's arguing towards one another. Excuse my cat back there. To Adam, after the fall, he cursed Adam first. Because you had listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I command you, you must not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. So basically saying, if you don't work, you don't eat. If you don't put in the work, you don't get to eat. You don't get to just take all of the good things that I have provided for you now that you have committed this sin. He's basically saying, I'm taking everything that I gave you away without death, without he's taking everything away that would provide comfort, that would provide a hospitable environment, without work, without Adam putting in the effort and putting in the work. So he just made it basically what it is today, where we have to farm, we have to produce our own food, which I think is interesting. It's God's kind of healthcare. If you don't work, you don't eat. I find that to be very interesting, and man, there may be some really interesting advice in there, right? But take a look at something too there. God chose, first of all, Adam to punish first, then for listening to his wife. First of all, it's not that Adam was fell under temptation of the serpent. It's not that Adam bit the forbidden fruit first, or Adam thought that this was a good idea first. And there may be some psychological implications here that we're missing on the man's side and on the woman's side. I think that would be far more interesting to exploit and to look into. Not for the sake of this video, however, I will just throw this out there. Could it be that the serpent chose the woman? He's a little bit more subtle than most of the beasts of the field. So could he have chosen the woman because the woman was more agreeable? This is a very interesting question that we have to ask ourselves, that may tell us something about ourselves that we don't really recognize, or that isn't insanely obvious without some help from from the Creator himself, who may know us a little bit better than we know ourselves, right? I mean, after all, he did create us, so it would stand to reason, right? So anyways, I find it to be interesting from a psychological point of view, at least. But then he goes over to Eve and he says, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. So, at first glance, that seems kind of odd, like he, especially that last verse there. If we pick that apart, he shall rule over you. So, what we can insinuate after the curse is that before the curse, they were equal, right? And it sounds like in almost every way, right? He shall rule over you. So there are going to be things that, that Adam can do that she cannot, or else, he wouldn't be able to rule over her, correct? So how did all of this change the world, right? And I go back to the verse that we just said for the curse on Adam, and it will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat of the plants of the field. It will produce thorns and thistles. So the world went from a very peaceful, thriving universe or world that literally you could just walk to any tree or plant, it seems like, and it had some type of fruit that we could sustain ourselves for. So then the curse happened, and God kind of took all these things away, and especially when he said that because you listen to your wife, curses the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat of it all the days of your life. So painful toil meaning you have to produce this now. You have to make this now. This isn't just going to be handed to you and provided to you like it was because you decided not to listen to me. This is what you get. I find this to be extremely, revealing, at least. And what was the penalty for committing this sin? Is a good question. But why also was the penalty for committing this sin so dramatic, so drastic? Right. Well, let's jump into the next. Let's answer the first question and then we'll get into it. So, what is the penalty for committing this sin? Well, Genesis 3:17 and 19 says, "By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, and for you are now dust, and to dust you shall return." Basically saying there, you will provide for yourself to sustain your living until you die. And I think it's insanely interesting that we have God says that they shall surely die if they eat from the or from the fruit that is in the midst of the garden. But they didn't die immediately, right? Adam is recordedly to have lived at least to be 900 something years old. So he didn't die immediately after. And I say 900 something, which is a long time, but think about this too though. Adam wasn't birthed. He was created. So in mind you, Adam was created from God created Adam mature. He created man. He created a mature human. And mind you, because this stands to reason, and this is also very, important to, for, consistency. This is important to note that not only did he create a mature and, older, I guess you could say, man and female, right? But he also created a mature universe, a mature world. So then it stands to reason why, if we were taking the theory of a young Earth theory, how the light from the stars is already there. And plus it said in like chapter 2, I think, that the stars will illuminate light, and the moon also will give light. There will be a lesser light in the night, and then there will be a better light in the day. And I think that's amazing, first of all, because that gives us an answer as to this, what many people would suggest, this old Earth versus young Earth mentality, right? It gives us a better understanding as to how it's possible, right? Simply put, God creates everything kind of mature, so it stands to reason, if we're being consistent with God's creation on man, it would also be in the universe and on the world as well, right? It can be applied both. So let's move on. Just as a side tangent, just as a small note I would make there, now this is a little bit later, and here's kind of a an interesting. here, in my opinion, here is something that is very interesting. Romans chapter 6, verse 23 says, "For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord." Did you get that first part? For the wages of sin is death. What Adam and Eve committed, what they did was commit sin, which was which, well, I won't reveal that just yet, but it was going against a commandment that God set for them, right? This is a set commandment. Don't do this. And I think Genesis chapter 3, verse 17 through 19 there is saying the exact same thing. Or no, I'm sorry. I think that is just 17. I don't think I read all the way through. But I think it's very interesting that we see this, this finer understanding, like thousands or like hundreds of years later. I mean, you got to think between the Old Testament and New Testament, there's 400 years in between. And Romans is New Testament. It's kind of later on in the New Testament by Paul, written by Paul, right, to the Romans. But Genesis was written, I believe Moses wrote all 5, which is the Torah. He wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. And then some odd years later, this perfectly encaptures what Genesis is saying, is that for the wages of sin is death. What we had was the grace and mercy of God. What we had was God's glory. We had heaven literally on earth. Then we decided to follow the words of a serpent that ultimately led to our demise. So this all is great and all, but it begs the question, what is sin? Sin is an immoral act considered to be a transgression against divine law, against God's commandment. Okay, so why is sin so bad? Would be the next question I would ask. If sin is an immoral act or transgression against the divine law, then when we engage in simple activities, we are going against God's guidance for us. And this also plays out in a much more simpler way. You'll notice that if you live a life of sin, if you live a life of making sinful decisions and choices, you will typically be in a much more difficult state of being, which may not be so obvious at first. However, you are creating a foundation of kind of like a house of cards, right? You're building a structure made out of flimsy cards that one gust of wind will come and just wreck everything. You may think everything is going to plan, but that's just simply because you haven't gone against, or something hasn't came to test you, right? So we'll keep that in mind. What does God know about sin that we don't? God obviously views sin or this transgression against his commandments very highly. He obviously doesn't like it. He went as far as to basically banish heaven from earth and quit providing fruits, vegetables, whatever, his own personal food source because of their very transgression against his commandment for them. So what does God know about sin that we don't? Why is sin so bad? To understand this more clearly, we have to really dive into the specific sins that are that we commit, revealing their bad habits and what makes it so bad. So, in other words, it's not insanely obvious at first, but when you keep giving in to sin, or when you keep committing sin, it will become increasingly obvious why sin is so bad. Why most people find it, weird or uncomfortable to be around creeps is because creeps have this just more than obvious persona of lust that comes off not so subtly, right? It comes off in a way that is very creepy and very disturbing to those who, but what they're engaging in, what they're acting in, is what their flesh is desiring, what their flesh is seeking, right? Not their spirit, what their flesh is seeking. However, consider this. 1 Corinthians 15:44. If there is a natural body, there is also a supernatural body. There is a spiritual body. In the spirit of being, no pun intended, if the spirit of being intellectually consistent, it would also stand to reason that we live in a universe that also shares a common feature with its residents. Simply put it, the physical earth also is inhabited by spiritual properties. And I am so excited to share with you guys this kind of evidential support or evidence that supports this claim within my new segment, How Does God Work in Mysterious Ways? You've probably heard it said, God works in mysterious ways, but the question still remains, how? How does God work in mysterious ways? Well, I'm glad you asked, because we're going to be getting into it. So this really begins to unveil a battle that is fought internally. It's not always obviously a physical battle, or it doesn't always appear to be a physical battle very obviously. This is an internal struggle. This is an internal battle that we deal with on a daily basis. We as Christians, or we as non-Christians, who don't understand that there are rules to be applied here. It's not that we all are not affected by it, or it's not that we all are affected by it, we just don't recognize it. It's that we don't realize there's spiritual warfare here because we don't realize that there is even a spiritual property here. So, for instance, think about a piece of land, right? And then think about a bunch of people living on that piece of land. Now, think about this for a second. As they are living their individual lives, um, going about their business, creating their homes, providing for their families, all this kind of stuff. Bad things start to occur. Bad things start to happen in their lives, right? People start to steal from one another. People start to lie and deceive one another about these, you know, uh, transgressions or sins that they have committed. We'll use that terminology for now. Then they say, well, there has to be some type of law. There has to be some type of order here, or else this chaos will just fester and boil and it'll just brew for who knows how long if we don't put an end to it. So we have to create some kind of justice system that everybody benefits from. So for some people, and this is very obvious if you go to different countries and if you travel, um, some places allow certain narcotics, certain drugs. Some people allow certain firearms, certain forms of protection, weaponry of such. And some places don't allow these things. And I think what we're noticing here is that people, forgive me once again, people don't realize that there is a law and order. We are living our lives as if there is no sin that we are committing because we're not aware of this. We're not made aware of these sins. So if we're not made aware of these sins, then we're just going to live our lives the way we deem necessary or we see fit based on the way we want, based on the way we interpret and view the world, right? Well, this is where it becomes very interesting, because if the way I view the world is through a secular, thinking, trying to live separate from any kind of ideology that has to do anything with God, separating myself, secular belief, then I don't know the customs, or I don't know what sin, or I don't know what commandments, or what laws, or I don't know anything about this God or these moral laws that he puts in place. I don't know anything about him because I'm living a secular life. I'm living a life separated from him. So how would I know anything about him? How would I know anything about his laws? How would I know anything about what he says or does, or anything about him? How would I know anything about God's laws if I never studied or paid attention or went to church or read the book, read the Bible? How would I know anything about God if I didn't take the time to know God, or if I didn't take the time to learn about God? You wouldn't. One of the something that I love to do is try to help bridge the gap. I've made it my life's mission to bridge the gap between the supernatural and the physical. However, there's only one way I can do this. And here's an analogy that I can give to help better illustrate how I could possibly achieve this goal of showing you guys how God works in mysterious ways. First of all, you have to recognize who Christ is. You have to know who God is. You have to know who Christ is to really even be able to point him out in a crowd. The analogy I'll use is this. If I gave you a book that says, "Where's Waldo?" across it, and I give you a "Where's Waldo" book, and you flip through all the pages, you could probably have that done in like a week, right? I give you a highlighter so you can circle the locations in which you were successfully able to point him out in a crowd. And then you hand the book back to me, and I review it, and I see that you have successfully, every single page, been able to find Waldo. Now, let's say I give you a book that says, Where's Steve? Now, because it was Where's Waldo, in your guys' mind, because you know who Waldo is, you knew exactly the character that I was describing instantly. Because I said, Where's Waldo? That triggered your minds to be able to recognize and know who Waldo was and who I'm talking about. Who am I referring to? You probably even pictured, some of you obviously can't because, I forget what it's called, but some of you who are visual, who are visual thinkers, who can, see these things in your mind's eye, you were able to probably even see the brown-haired with the swoop glasses, circular glasses, shirt with a cap of the red and white stripes, and blue jeans with, I think sometimes he has a cane, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he has a backpack, sometimes he doesn't. You were able to think of that, and you were instantly able to resonate with that and cling to that idea and picture of Waldo because you know who Waldo is. But if I said, all right, and I handed you a book that didn't have, any information about who Steve is, what if I told you and I handed you this book that didn't have Waldo's picture on it, or, not Waldo, but didn't have Steve's picture on it, but all of a sudden there were these crowds of people, or let's just say this, let's say I hand you the book, Where's Waldo, but instead of trying to find Waldo, now the same book that you just finished for me, now I want you to find Steve in this book. You're going to look at me like I'm freaking crazy. What do you mean, Steve? Who is Steve? So how, if you don't know who Steve is, how are you able to point Steve out in a crowd? All right. Now let me ask you this. If you don't know who Christ is, if you don't know who God is, how are you supposed to know God or Christ was even working in your life to begin with? If we don't know Christ, we are not going to be able to recognize the times in which God is working in our lives. If we don't know God, we will not be able to look back in our lives and recognize all the times God was moving, God was working in our lives. If we don't know who Christ is, if we don't know who God is, we are not going to be able to pick him out in a crowd. Sin has affected us greatly to the degree in which we have become our own gods. And unfortunately, what that means is that we have rejected all realities and have substituted our own realities in hopes of living the life that we want to live and not should live. There's a big difference between the life that we should live and the life that we want to live. But here is the internal struggle. Here's the battle. Here's the difficult moment in our lives, in my life and in your life. We have to accept and want to accept God in our lives. In order for him to work, in order to recognize who it is that is working in our life, we have to get to know him better. And let me tell you something, it's not so easy. You want to know why it's not easy? Because you have this entity who likes to go against God, who likes to change and alter, and who likes to counterfeit all of the characteristics of God, who likes to make fun and mock God, and then projects that onto us, well, because we're made in his image. Satan won't pick on you if you're not a threat to him. He won't touch you if you're not a threat to him. However, the moment you make him uncomfortable, the moment you start going against him, he'll throw everything he can at you. At the worst possible moment in your life as well. At the most difficult time. He will make you regret that. However, let me tell you something. We may have three things going against us in this spiritual warfare. We've got the flesh going against us, our very own bodies going against us. And as a result of that, we have the ways of the world, other people's flesh and desires being projected onto us. And then we have the demonic that likes to instigate the previous two, who likes to rattle the cages, who likes to set in motion these things. And let me tell you something. That may seem unfair. That may seem difficult, and it may seem like we have got our work cut out for us. But don't you dare tell your problems to God and say, God, man, look at these problems. Look how big these problems are. Look how overwhelming. Look how just outrageous these problems are. But instead, tell your problems how big your God is. If we choose to perceive the world through a negative point of view, we will only see the bad in it. If we choose to view the world through a positive point of view, we will only see the good that's in it. What I'm saying is that when Adam and Eve fell and they were given this sense of consciousness, similar to what I believe a child experiences, right? A child can run around naked after they get out of the tub and be completely unashamed and feel no guilt for it or feel no shame for it. But when they grow up and they mature and they realize that there is something to this, their parts are different than my parts, there is this thing of shame and guilt that's there. There's this level of consciousness that appears and rises in our minds. And I truly don't think that it is based upon societies and society's way of thinking, because there are tribes who, yeah, they don't wear a lot of clothes, but who wear clothes nonetheless. They cover themselves up. Why is it, human behavior to naturally just want to cover ourselves up? What is it that we're hiding? And psychologically, I think that what we're hiding is our nakedness. And in the physical and in the psychological, we are hiding our nakedness that is also our most vulnerable. We're hiding the vulnerability that we have. And we're vulnerable because we fell. And we fell because we chose to not listen to God's commandment, God's guidance in our lives, but chose to go our own direction. So that's pretty much it. That wraps it up. What is sin? I hope this really helped enlighten some of your guys' ideas about it. And one thing I want to leave you with is that this level of consciousness that we are given now, this level of good versus evil that we are given now, really does ultimately one thing for us, and that questions God's authority, just like the serpent did, God's word, God's commandment in our lives, that questions that. And it alters our brain and it alters our decision making to now, I want to be my own God. And it makes perception reality instead of reality being our perception. I think that's ultimately one of the biggest things that this knowledge distorted for us. It was knowledge of good and evil. And I guess in many different ways you can now just literally say that ignorance was bliss. That perhaps knowledge wasn't as good as what we thought it could be. And a lot of people will try to make this into a moral argument and say, look how evil your God is, that he decided that he didn't want you to have this knowledge. I think God was still trying to implement faith. Have faith in me that I'm telling you to make the right decision. And now we have to learn the hard way of faith. So anyways, I'll leave you with that. And man, I can't wait for this segment and the next. I'm excited to bring this information to you guys of what is sin and exposing the sin in our lives and the physical applications to what these sins do to us and the spiritual applications to what these sins do to us. Because just like 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 44 tells us, is that for every physical being there is a spiritual being. And if that's true, it would be intellectually consistent to apply that to most things. You don't have to be so literal with it on every occasion, but on most of it, it will stand to reason. Which is why I'm so excited to expose the sin in our lives, to hope give us a better understanding as to why it's so important not to engage in it, why it's so important to stay away from it, right? So that's pretty much it. That's all I got for you for the first one, the intro to what is sin, doing a deep dive into the sin that's in our lives. And hopefully it'll get down to the bottom of all of it and help us become better Christians, help us to become better followers of God. Because I truly believe that when a parent says, do something because I told you so, that's not what gets us to do it. That's not what motivates us and inspires us to go do what they told us to. What really motivates an individual to do something is if they believe in that. And if we all look at the evidence to support the claims that sin is bad for us, and if we all understand the implications of sin and why it's so bad for us in our lives, then perhaps we will be more inclined to believe God when he says, don't do this. Or try to guide us and direct us away from committing that sin. So anyways, though, guys, take care. I hope you guys have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next one.